In the quiet town of Briar Hollow, where mist curled around the treetops each morning and the river whispered secrets to the stones along its bank, life moved at a gentle pace. People knew one another by name, waved from porches, and remembered birthdays without reminders. It was the kind of place where weddings weren't just events, they were community milestones, stitched into the fabric of local memory for years to come. And this year, everyone was talking about Elowen's wedding. Elowen had grown up in Briar Hollow, the only child of Maris and Thorn, two people who carried themselves with a kind of polished reserve that made neighbors admire them from a distance, but rarely feel close. Maris, once the principal of the town's only high school, still spoke with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. Thorn, retired from his role as a regional bank manager, wore his suits even on weekends and measured success in neat columns of profit and propriety. They weren't unkind, just careful. Careful about who they associated with, how they spent their time, and what reflected on their name. Elowen, though, had always been different. She laughed loudly, asked too many questions, and once spent an entire summer tracking the migration patterns of monarch butterflies with nothing but a notebook and a second-hand bike. Now in her late 20s, she worked as a marine biologist, splitting her time between coastal research stations and home visits to her parents. Her passion wasn't just a job, it was a calling. She believed the ocean held answers to healing the planet, and she spoke about coral reefs and sea turtles with a reverence most reserved for poetry or prayer. Then she met Cale. He wasn't from Briar Hollow. He'd come to town 2 years earlier to restore an old Victorian house on the edge of the woods, a project most locals had written off as a lost cause. Cale saw beauty in the rotting beams and cracked plaster. He worked slowly, deliberately, sanding each floorboard by hand and matching paint colors to century-old samples. People watched him from their windows, curious about the quiet man who whistled while he worked and always said good morning, even when no one answered. Elowen first noticed him at the farmer's market, where he was buying heirloom tomatoes with exact change and a shy smile. They struck up a conversation about soil pH and heirloom seeds, topics neither expected to bond over. And by sunset, they were sitting on a bench by the river, sharing stories like old friends. There was no grand confession, no dramatic moment, just two people who felt almost immediately that they'd been waiting for each other without knowing it. Their love grew quietly, like moss on stone, steady, patient, and deeply rooted. They spent weekends hiking through the pines, cooking meals with ingredients from Cale's garden, and talking late into the night about everything from climate policy to the best way to fix a leaky faucet. Cale listened when Elowen spoke about the ocean, not just with interest but with awe, and Elowen admired how Cale treated every person he met, with the same respect he gave to the old houses he restored. He believed things, and people, deserved a second chance. When he proposed, it was on a foggy morning at the edge of the Briar River. He didn't get down on one knee or pull out a velvet box. Instead, he handed her a small wooden carving, a sea turtle, its shell etched with tiny waves. "I made this," he said, voice soft. "It's not perfect, but it's honest." "Like us," Elowen cried, not because of the ring he slipped on her finger moments later, but because he'd seen her, not just the scientist, not just the daughter of Maris and Thorn, but the woman who loved tide pools and rainy Sundays and believed kindness could change the world. News of the engagement spread quickly. Most people were happy for them, but not everyone. Maris and Thorn had met Cale only once before the proposal, at a dinner Elowen insisted on hosting. They'd been polite, of course. Maris served her famous rosemary lamb, and Thorn poured wine with practiced grace. But throughout the meal there was a stiffness in the air, like a door left slightly ajar in winter. They asked Cale about his work, his family, his plans, but their questions felt more like inspections than conversations. "Your father's a carpenter?" Maris had asked, stirring her tea with a delicate clink. "Yes," Cale replied. "He's been building and restoring homes for over 40 years. "Ah," Thorn said, nodding slowly.
"So self-employed then?"
Cale smiled. "In a way. He owns a small workshop. Does custom furniture too." Maris exchanged a glance with Thorn, just a flicker, but Elowen saw it. It was the same look they'd given her when she'd announced she wanted to study marine biology instead of law. The look that said, "We hope you know what you're doing." They didn't say anything outright. They never would, But over the next few weeks, little comments began to slip out. Always when Cale wasn't around, always wrapped in the guise of concern. He's very earnest, Maris told her book club, sipping chamomile tea. But I wonder if he understands the kind of life Elowen is used to. Thorne, at the golf club, chuckled to a friend. Nice fellow. Quiet. Though I hear his father still lives in that old trailer park outside Cedar Ridge. Can't imagine that's easy for Elowen. Elowen heard about these remarks secondhand. From a cousin, from a neighbor, from the florist who also did arrangements for Maris's bridge group. Each time her stomach tightened. She wanted to believe her parents would come around. After all, they'd raised her to value character over status, effort over ease. But lately it felt like they were measuring Cale against a ruler he never agreed to use. What they didn't know, what no one in Briar Hollow knew yet, was that Cale's father, Darian, was not just a carpenter. He was a man shaped by loss, resilience, and quiet generosity. Darian had raised Cale alone after his wife passed away when Cale was just 8. There were no grand speeches or dramatic rescues in their story, just long nights of reading bedtime stories, early mornings fixing school lunches, and weekends spent teaching his son how to plane wood and listen to the wind. Darian never remarried. He said his heart had enough room for one great love, and he'd already lived it. He lived modestly in a small cottage behind his workshop, surrounded by gardens and half-finished projects. His hands were rough, his clothes often stained with sawdust, but his eyes held a calm that people noticed the moment they met him. He didn't talk much about himself, but if you asked about trees or tides or the way light falls through a window at dawn, he could speak for hours. When Cale told him about Elowen, Darian didn't ask about her family or her job. He asked, "Does she make you want to be better?" Cale had nodded. "Every day," Darian smiled. "Then she's the one." As the wedding date approached, set for the first Saturday in October when the leaves turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and apples, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Elowen tried to include Darian in every planning meeting, but Maris gently insisted that certain traditions be handled by those familiar with them. She meant herself. Thorne took charge of the guest list, subtly omitting a few of Kyle's childhood friends, calling them not quite the right fit, Kyle noticed. He didn't complain, he wasn't that kind of man, but Elowen saw the hurt in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She held his hand tighter at night, whispered reassurances, and promised that after the wedding they'd build a life far from judgment and expectation. Still, she worried. Not about the marriage, she had no doubts there, but about the day itself. She wanted it to be joyful, not strained. She wanted her parents to see Cale the way she did, not as a man from a different background, but as someone whose heart was as steady as the oldest oak in the forest. The week before the wedding, Darian arrived in Briar Hollow. He came in his old pickup truck, its bed filled with tools, suitcases, and a large wooden crate covered with a tarp. He checked into a small bed and breakfast on the edge of town, not wanting to impose. But Elowen insisted he stay with her and Cale in the rental cottage they'd secured for the month. The first evening they sat on the porch, sipping herbal tea as fireflies blinked in the dusk. Darian listened more than he spoke, but when Elowen described her dream of protecting coastal ecosystems, his eyes lit up. "My wife loved the ocean," he said quietly. "She used to say it was the Earth's heartbeat." Elowen reached over and squeezed his hand. In that moment she felt a connection deeper than blood, a shared understanding of love that endures, even in absence. But not everyone felt that warmth. At the rehearsal dinner, hosted at Maris and Thorne's elegant home, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The table was set with heirloom china and crystal glasses. Candles flickered in silver holders. It should have been lovely, and it was on the surface. Darian arrived in a clean button-down shirt and dark slacks, his hair neatly combed, his boots polished. He brought a bottle of local cider as a gift. Maris accepted it with a tight smile. "Lovely of you to come," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. During dinner, Thorne asked Darian about his workshop. "Must be hard working with your hands these days." "Everything's automated now." Darian simply nodded. "Machines are fast, but hands understand grain, weight, balance. They remember." A silence followed. Then Maris turned to a guest and said, just loud enough for the table to hear, "Isn't it sweet how some people still believe in doing things the old-fashioned way?" Cale's jaw tightened. Elowen placed a hand on his knee under the table. Later, as guests mingled in the garden, Maris stood near the rose bushes with two of her closest friends. "I suppose we should be grateful he's not wearing overalls," she murmured, glancing toward Darian, who was helping clear plates without being asked. One friend shifted uncomfortably. "He seems kind." "Oh, I'm sure he is," Maris replied, sipping her wine. "But kindness doesn't pay the bills. Or fit in at a place like this." Darian heard it. Not all of it, but enough. He didn't react. He simply finished stacking the dishes, thanked the caterer, and stepped into the cool night air. Cale found him sitting on the front steps staring at the stars. "You okay, Dad?" Darian nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how people build walls without realizing they're locking themselves in." Kyle sat beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. The crickets sang. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Back inside, Aloan excused herself from the crowd and walked to the edge of the property where the woods began. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the ache in her chest. She loved her parents, but she loved Cale more. And she hated that the two parts of her life felt like they were on opposite sides of a river with no bridge. The next morning, the sky was clear and bright. The wedding was tomorrow. Vendors arrived early. Florists with armfuls of white peonies and eucalyptus, musicians tuning violins under the trees, caterers setting up long tables draped in ivory linen. Aloan moved through it all like a ghost, smiling when needed, answering questions, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Darian's quiet dignity, about how he'd never once complained, even when treated like an outsider in his own son's future family. She thought about the wooden sea turtle he'd helped Cale carve as an engagement gift, about the way he'd looked at her when she talked about the ocean, not with confusion, but with recognition. That afternoon, while everyone was busy with final fittings and seating charts, Aloan drove to the bed and breakfast where Darian had stayed before moving in with them. She found him in the garden, helping the owner repot ferns. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. He smiled. "Always." They worked in silence for a while, their hands in the soil. Finally, Aloan spoke. "I'm sorry about last night." Darian shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology, Aloan." "But they're your parents," he said gently. "Their fears are theirs to carry. Not yours to fix." She looked at him, surprised. "You're not angry?" "I was," he admitted, for a moment. "But then I remembered something my father told me. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. But don't let it change who you are." Tears welled in her eyes. "You're a better person than I am." "No," he said, brushing dirt from his hands. "I just learned early that pride is heavy, and love is light." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Aloan made a decision. She wouldn't let fear or judgment steal the joy from her wedding day. She would stand beside Cale, look into his eyes, and promise her life to him, not in spite of who they were, but because of it. And Darian? He went to his room, opened the large wooden crate he'd brought from home, and carefully unwrapped what he'd been working on for 2 years. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't glitter under the reception lights. But it came from a place deeper than pride, from a place of love that asked for nothing in return. Tomorrow, he would give his gift. And though he didn't know it yet, that simple act would do more than surprise the guests. It would change everything. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and golden, as if the sky itself had dressed for the occasion. Mist hovered over the meadow where the ceremony would take place, curling around the white chairs and the arched trellis draped in ivy and baby's breath. Birds sang from the treetops, and the air carried the sweet scent of late-blooming wildflowers. It was the kind of day people remember forever, not because it was perfect, but because it felt alive, full of quiet promise. Aloan woke before sunrise. She didn't need an alarm. Her heart had been racing since the moment she opened her eyes. She sat up slowly, wrapped in the quilt her grandmother had stitched decades ago, and looked out the window of the cottage she and Cale had rented for the month. The world outside was still half asleep, bathed in that hushed blue light that comes just before dawn. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Today was the day she would marry the man who made her feel seen. Not for her resume or her family name, but for the way she laughed when she tripped over her own feet or cried during nature documentaries. Down the hall, she heard soft footsteps. Cale was already up. He always rose early, a habit from years of working with wood before the summer heat set in. She found him in the kitchen, barefoot and in a worn cotton shirt, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He turned when she entered, and his face softened the way it always did when he saw her, like someone coming home after a long journey. "Nervous?" he asked, handing her a mug. "A little," she admitted, wrapping her hands around the warmth. "Not about us, just everything else." He nodded. He understood. They both knew what she meant. The unspoken tension, the sideways glances, the quiet judgments that had hovered over their engagement like a shadow. But Cale had never let it define them. Instead, he'd focused on what mattered. Building a life with her, one honest day at a time. They sat together on the porch as the sun climbed higher, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. No grand speeches, no dramatic confessions, just 2 people sharing a moment before the storm of the day began. And it was enough. By mid-morning, the cottage buzzed with activity. Elowen's closest friends arrived to help her get ready. Leora, a ceramic artist with ink-stained fingers and a laugh like wind chimes, and Nessa, a schoolteacher who could calm a room with a single look. They fussed over her hair, debated the perfect shade of lip color, and played soft music from an old speaker that crackled at the edges. Elowen watched herself in the mirror as they worked, not seeing a bride but a woman on the edge of something new. Meanwhile, across town, Darian rose early and dressed with care. He chose a dark gray suit, not new but well kept, and a pale blue tie that matched the color of the sea on a clear day. He shaved slowly, his hands steady despite the weight in his chest. He wasn't nervous about the ceremony. He'd stood by his son through harder days than this. But he knew today would test more than vows. It would test hearts. He packed a small bag with a change of clothes, his reading glasses, and the wrapped gift he'd carried with him from home. It sat in a plain brown box tied with twine, no name tag, no flourish, just a box. But inside it held 2 years of secret planning, late-night phone calls with lawyers, and countless hours walking a stretch of coastline that most people had forgotten. Before leaving, he stood for a moment in his workshop, running a hand over the workbench where he'd taught Cale to sandwood without leaving swirls. "You did good, son," he whispered to the empty room. Then he locked the door and drove toward Briar Hollow. Back at the meadow, guests began to arrive. Cars lined the gravel road and children darted between trees with ribbons tied in their hair. Maris and Thorn were among the first to appear, dressed in matching tones of cream and taupe, their expressions carefully composed. They greeted guests with practiced warmth, accepting compliments on the venue, the flowers, the lovely turnout, but their eyes kept scanning the crowd, as if waiting for something, or someone to disrupt the perfection they'd envisioned. When Darian's truck pulled up, a few heads turned, not out of malice but curiosity. It was an old vehicle, dented in places with a faded sticker on the back window that read, "Protect Our Shores." He stepped out slowly, adjusting his jacket, and walked toward the seating area with quiet dignity. Maris noticed him immediately. She leaned toward Thorn and murmured, "He actually came in that?" Thorn sighed. "I suppose we should be grateful he didn't bring tools." A woman nearby, Mrs. Calloway, who'd taught Elowen piano as a child, overheard and frowned slightly, but said nothing. She'd met Darian once when he'd fixed her porch railing for free after a storm. She remembered his kindness, not his truck. Darian didn't head for the front row. Instead, he went straight to the edge of the setup, where the venue staff struggled to secure the floral arch against a light breeze. Without a word, he rolled up his sleeves and began helping, tightening ropes, adjusting stakes, steadying the frame. The staff thanked him, surprised by his skill. He just nodded and kept working. Maris watched from a distance, arms crossed. "He's very hands-on," she said to a friend, her voice light but her tone sharp. The friend hesitated. "He seems helpful." "Helpful," Maris repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it." Nearby, Cale stood with his groomsmen, laughing at an old story. But his eyes kept drifting toward his father. He saw the way people glanced at Darian, not with warmth but with uncertainty. He saw the way his future in-laws held themselves apart, like observers at a play they didn't quite understand. And he felt that familiar knot in his stomach, the one that came from loving 2 worlds that refused to meet. But then Elowen appeared. She walked down the makeshift aisle on her father's arm, not in a cloud of tulle, but in a simple dress of ivory linen that moved like water. Her hair was loose with a single sprig of lavender tucked behind her ear. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at Cale. And in that moment, everything else faded. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, and full of quiet truth. They wrote their own vows, not poetic but real. Cale promised to listen even when it was hard. Elowen promised to never stop believing in the good in people, even when it was hard to see. They exchanged rings made of recycled silver, and when the officiant pronounced them married, they kissed not for the cameras, but for each other. Guests clapped, some with tears in their eyes. Even Maris smiled, genuine if brief. For a few minutes it felt like the world had softened, but the real test would come later. At the reception, held under a canopy of string lights and flowing fabric, the mood was light and joyful. A local string quartet played gentle melodies, waiters passed trays of roasted vegetables and herb-crusted salmon, and laughter rose like music. Elowen and Cale shared their first dance to a song Cale's mother used to sing, a folk tune about rivers finding the sea. Darian watched from the edge of the dance floor, his eyes glistening. During cocktail hour, as guests mingled with drinks in hand, the old habits returned. Maris stood near the champagne fountain with two women from her garden club. "It's a beautiful event," one said. "Elowen looks radiant." "She does," Maris agreed. Then, lowering her voice just enough, "Though I must say I'm surprised his father dressed so appropriately. I half expected flannel." The women exchanged glances but said nothing. One changed the subject quickly. Thorne, meanwhile, held court near the bar. "Fine young man, Cale," he told a retired colleague. "A bit rough around the edges, but Elowen will polish him. She always was good at fixing things." The man chuckled politely, though his eyes flicked toward Darian, who was now helping a server carry a tray of glasses. "He seems like a decent sort." "Decent," Thorne echoed, swirling his whiskey. "Yes, decent is sufficient." The words weren't shouted. They weren't cruel in the way cruelty is often imagined, but they were dismissive. And in a room full of people who knew how to read between the lines, they landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward, unseen but felt. Kyle heard it. He was standing near the bar, waiting for a drink, when Thorne's voice carried over the hum of conversation. He didn't react. He just turned and walked away, his jaw tight. He wouldn't let anger steal this day. But the hurt was there, quiet and deep. Darian heard it too. He was placing his gift on the present table, a simple folding table covered in lace, surrounded by glittering boxes and glossy bags. His box looked out of place, plain brown paper, twine, no card. He set it down gently, then stepped back. He didn't seek attention. He never had. But as he turned, he caught Maurice's eye. She looked at him, then at the box, then back at him, her expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. Then she turned away. Later during dinner, the wedding planner announced that, per family tradition, they would acknowledge a few special gifts during the toasts. It was Maris's idea, a way to highlight the thoughtful contributions of close friends and relatives. Most gifts had name tags. Darian's did not. When the planner reached his box, she paused. "We have one unmarked gift here. Perhaps it's from a shy guest." Elowen, curious, stood up. "I'll open it." She carried the box to the center of the dance floor, where a small spotlight shone. The chatter quieted. Even the musicians stopped playing. All eyes turned to her. She untied the twine slowly, peeled back the paper, and lifted the lid. Inside was a wooden music box hand-carved from driftwood, its surface etched with waves, seashells, and a single sea turtle swimming toward the horizon. It was beautiful, not in a showy way, but in the way something made with love always is. She wound the key on the side. A soft melody began to play. Clair de Lune, but slowed, gentler like waves lapping at shore. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "It's stunning." But then Elowen noticed something else. Beneath the music box lay a thick envelope, sealed with red wax. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter and a legal deed. She read the first lines aloud, her voice shaking. "Elowen and Cale, you've shown me that love isn't about where you come from, but where you're willing to go together. 2 years ago, I learned a developer planned to build luxury condos on a stretch of untouched coastline near Havens Point, the same place your mother, Elowen, once told me you dreamed of protecting, so I bought it. All 12 acres. With the help of marine biologists, local officials, and a small endowment I've saved over the years. It's now a protected conservation site named the Elowen and Kale Marine Sanctuary. It's yours. Not as a gift to impress, but as a promise that love can leave something behind that matters. Silence. Not the polite silence of surprise, but the deep, breathless quiet of awe. Elowen looked up, tears streaming down her face. He bought the land, the whole coast. Kale stared at his father, stunned. Dad, you never said anything. Darian stood, not with pride, but with quiet humility. It wasn't about saying. It was about doing. Then the deed was passed around, signed, notarized, complete with maps and conservation easements. Experts in the crowd recognized the names on the permits. Respected scientists, environmental lawyers, even a state senator who'd championed coastal protection. Maris sat very still. Her wine glass, half raised, trembled in her hand. Thorne stared at the floor, his face pale. This wasn't just a gift. It was a legacy, and it came from the man they'd dismissed as just a carpenter. A woman near the back began to cry. Another whispered, "That's the most selfless thing I've ever seen." The room, once divided by unspoken judgments, now felt united by something deeper, respect. But the night wasn't over yet. As the music started again, softer now, more thoughtful, Maris stood. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. She walked across the grass, her heels sinking slightly into the earth, and stopped in front of Darian. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I was wrong." Darian didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply nodded. "We all are sometimes." Thorne approached next, slower, more awkward. I didn't understand," he admitted. "But I see it now." Darian offered his hand. Thorne took it, and in that handshake something shifted, not just between them, but in the air itself. The walls didn't vanish overnight, but a door opened. Elowen and Kale watched from the edge of the dance floor, holding each other tightly. "You okay?" Kale asked. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "More than okay. I feel seen. All of us." Later, as the stars came out and the fireflies returned, Darian sat alone for a moment on a bench beneath an oak tree. He didn't seek praise. He never had. But he allowed himself a small smile, not because he'd proven anything, but because he'd given something true, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. The days after the wedding settled like dust after a storm, quiet, golden, and full of small revelations. Briar Hollow returned to its usual rhythm, but something had shifted beneath the surface. People still waved from porches and bought bread at the same bakery. But now, when Darian's truck rumbled down Main Street, neighbors nodded with more than just politeness. They nodded with respect. Elowen and Kale spent their first week as a married couple in a rented cabin by the lake, far from expectations and unspoken rules. There were no schedules, no guest lists, no need to perform, just mornings wrapped in blankets, shared coffee, and long walks where they talked about everything and nothing. For the first time in months, Elowen felt her shoulders relax. The weight she hadn't realized she was carrying, the worry that her love wasn't enough to bridge two worlds, had lifted. But life doesn't stay quiet for long. By the second week, reality began to seep back in. Emails piled up. Elowen's research grant was due for renewal. Kyle had 3 restoration projects waiting on his desk. And then there was the sanctuary. News of Darian's gift had spread faster than anyone expected. Not through gossip, but through genuine awe. A local reporter wrote a short feature for the county paper. Carpenter's quiet gift creates coastal legacy. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. Within days, the story was picked up by a regional environmental blog, then shared by a marine conservation nonprofit. Suddenly, the Elowen and Kale Marine Sanctuary wasn't just a private dream. It was a public promise. Elowen received her first email from a high school teacher in the next county. "My students are doing a unit on local ecosystems. Would it be possible to visit the sanctuary?" She stared at the screen, heart pounding. This was real. It was happening. She called Darian that evening. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm as ever. "Did you see the article?" She asked. "I did," he said. "Didn't mean for it to get out." "But it's good," she insisted. "People care, Darian. They want to learn." He was quiet for a moment. Then we'd better be ready." Over the next few weeks, the three of them, Eloan, Cale, and Darian, began meeting weekly, not as in-laws or father and son, but as partners. They pored over maps, reviewed conservation guidelines, and sketched rough plans for walking paths, observation decks, and educational signage. Cale, with his eye for design, suggested using reclaimed wood from demolished barns for the structures. Darian knew exactly where to find it and who to ask. What surprised Eloan most wasn't the logistics, but the ease between them. There were no power struggles, no hidden agendas, just three people trying to honor something bigger than themselves. Meanwhile, back in Briar Hollow, Maris and Thorne moved through their days with a new kind of quiet. They didn't apologize loudly or make grand gestures. But small changes began to show. Maris canceled her usual Tuesday bridge game and instead volunteered at the town's nature center, helping sort donated field guides. When the director mentioned the new marine sanctuary, Maris didn't change the subject. She asked questions, real ones. How do they monitor water quality? Are there nesting sites for shorebirds? Thorne, for his part, started reading. Not financial reports, but books. On coastal erosion, on coral symbiosis, on the history of local fisheries. One evening, he left a worn copy of The Sea Around Us on Eloan's old nightstand during a visit. No note. Just the book, open to a page he'd underlined. The sea, once it casts its spell, holds one in its net of wonder forever. Eloan found it the next morning. She cried. Still, old habits don't vanish overnight. During a family dinner at Maris and Thorne's house, now held with less formality, more warmth, Thorne made a comment that slipped out before he could stop it. "So," he said, passing the roasted carrots, "you're really going to spend your time managing a beach?" Cale stiffened. Eloan opened her mouth to respond, but Darian, who rarely spoke at these gatherings, set down his fork gently. "It's not just a beach," he said, voice low but clear. "It's a nursery for juvenile fish, a buffer against storms, a place where kids can see a heron catch its dinner and understand that life doesn't need a price tag to matter." Silence fell. Thorne looked down at his plate. Then slowly he nodded. "I didn't know that." "You weren't meant to," Darian said, not unkindly, "but now you do." Later, as they washed dishes together, Eloan whispered to Cale, "Did you hear that?" Cale smiled. "First time he's ever corrected your father. And your dad didn't argue." "No," Cale said, drying a plate. He listened. That small moment, a correction met with humility, was more powerful than any apology. As autumn deepened, the sanctuary project gained momentum. Eloan took a temporary leave from her research station to focus on it full-time. Cale adjusted his work schedule, taking on fewer clients so he could help design the visitor facilities. Darian, meanwhile, became the quiet backbone of the operation, meeting with contractors, sourcing sustainable materials, even teaching local teens how to build bird boxes during weekend workshops. One Saturday morning, a group of students from the high school arrived for their first field trip. They came in a yellow bus, laughing and shoving each other, until they stepped onto the boardwalk and fell silent. The sanctuary wasn't manicured like a park. It was wild. Salt grasses swaying, ospreys circling overhead, the smell of brine and damp earth thick in the air. A volunteer handed each student a clipboard with observation sheets. Eloan stood at the edge of the group, watching as a girl with braids knelt to examine a crab scuttling through the tide pool. The girl looked up, eyes wide. "Is this ours to protect?" Eloan knelt beside her. "Yes, all of it." In that moment, she understood what Darian had known all along. The gift wasn't just land. It was responsibility and hope. Back in Briar Hollow, the town began to take notice. The local hardware store started carrying native plant seeds. The elementary school added a coastal stewards club. Even the diner added a sanctuary special to the menu. Clam chowder made with sustainably harvested shellfish, with a portion of proceeds going to the site's upkeep. Maris and Thorne visited the sanctuary for the first time on a crisp November afternoon. They didn't tell anyone they were coming. They just showed up, parked their car at the edge of the lot, and walked the main trail in silence. They saw the educational kiosk Kyle had built, its roof angled to catch rainwater, its panels made from recycled plastic. They read the signs Darian had helped write. Simple and clear. This marsh filters 2 million gallons of water a year. One oyster can clean 50 gallons of water a day. At the observation deck, they watched a pair of egrets wade through the shallows. Maris, who had once measured worth in titles and addresses, felt something unfamiliar. Awe. "We were wrong," she said finally, not looking at Thorne, but at the water. He didn't argue. Yes. They stayed until sunset, long after the other visitors had left. When they returned to their car, Thorne placed a small donation in the wooden box by the trailhead. Not for recognition, just because it felt right. Word of their visit reached Elowen through a volunteer. She didn't mention it to them. Some changes don't need to be named to be real. As winter approached, the sanctuary closed to the public for the season, partly to let the ecosystem rest, partly to allow construction to continue. Cale and Darian worked side by side on a small welcome center, its walls built from cedar logs salvaged from a storm-felled forest. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. Their hands spoke the same language: measuring, cutting, fitting, sanding. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in soft flakes, Cale paused and looked at his father. "Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" "All those years." Darian wiped sawdust from his brow. "Because it wasn't about you knowing. It was about her having it when she needed it. You could have said something after Mom died. You didn't have to do it all alone." Darian smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But grief is a private thing, and love is best given without fanfare." Cale thought about that. He thought about how his father had carried this dream in silence, through lonely winters and quiet birthdays, never expecting thanks. And he realized that the greatest acts of love are often the ones no one sees. Back at the cottage, Elowen sorted through applications for a new sanctuary coordinator. She wanted someone local, passionate, and patient. Someone who understood that conservation wasn't just science but storytelling. She interviewed a young woman named Rhea, who'd grown up fishing with her grandfather and now studied marine policy. Rhea spoke not in jargon but in memories. "I remember when the bay was so clear you could see your toes. I want my kids to see that too." Elowen hired her on the spot. That night, over stew and crusty bread, the three of them, Elowen, Cale, Darian, sat by the fire and made plans for spring. More trails, a native plant nursery, maybe even a small research station where students could stay overnight. "It's growing," Elowen said, stirring her tea. "Because it's needed," Darian replied. Outside, the snow fell gently, blanketing the world in white. But beneath it, roots were holding on, waiting. And in Briar Hollow, something else was growing too. Not in the ground, but in people. A new understanding, a slower kind of pride. The kind that comes not from what you have, but from what you give. Maris started attending town meetings about environmental policy. Thorne donated to a fund that provided boots and binoculars for school field trips. They didn't do it for praise. They did it because for the first time they saw the world through different eyes, not as something to control, but as something to care for. One evening, Elowen found a package on her doorstep. Inside was a hand-stitched quilt from Maris, its pattern inspired by tidal charts and ocean currents. Tucked in the folds was a note. "For your new home. May it be filled with the same love you've given the world." Elowen wrapped herself in it that night, tears in her eyes. It wasn't an apology. It was better. It was an offering. As the year turned, the sanctuary became more than a piece of land. It became a place where people came to remember what mattered. Teachers brought students. Families came on weekends. Retirees volunteered as trail guides. And every time someone asked, "Who made this possible?" the answer was always the same: a quiet man who believed love should leave something behind. Darian never sought credit. He still wore his old boots, still drank his coffee black, still spoke only when he had something true to say. But now when he walked into a room, people didn't just see a carpenter. They saw a man who gave the future a home. And in that, he'd given everyone, his son, his daughter-in-law, even those who once doubted him, a second chance to believe in what's possible when pride steps aside and love takes the lead. Spring returned to Briar Hollow with a quiet urgency, as if the earth itself was eager to make up for lost time. Crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow. Birds returned to the eaves of old barns, and the river swelled with meltwater, singing louder than it had all winter. And at the edge of the coast, the Alowan and Kale Marine Sanctuary stirred back to life. The Welcome Center, now complete with solar panels, rainwater collection barrels, and walls lined with local driftwood, stood ready for its first full season. Inside, Rhea, the new coordinator, hung student artwork on the walls. Watercolor paintings of herons, sketches of tidal pools, pressed seaweed arranged into constellations. Outside, volunteers raked paths, tested water quality kits, and planted native dune grasses to stabilize the shoreline. It wasn't a grand opening. It was something better. A slow, steady return to purpose. Alowan spent most of her days there, not as a scientist in a lab coat, but as a guide, a listener, sometimes just a presence sitting on a bench, watching the tide roll in. She'd traded spreadsheets for muddy boots, conference calls for conversations with curious kids who asked things like, "Do crabs have feelings? And why does the ocean taste like tears?" She loved it. Not because it was easy. Some days were long, rainy, and full of setbacks, but because it felt honest. Every shell collected, every bird counted, every seed planted was a small act of faith in a future worth protecting. Kyle, meanwhile, had taken on a new kind of work. He still restored old homes, but now he also designed eco-friendly structures for conservation sites up and down the coast. His latest project was a floating research platform for the sanctuary, built from recycled plastic and reclaimed timber, anchored just beyond the marsh. It would allow students to monitor water temperature, plankton levels, and fish migration without disturbing the ecosystem. He worked on it in the early mornings, before the sun cleared the trees, his hands moving with the same care he'd once used to restore Victorian banisters. Darian often joined him, not because he was needed, but because they both liked the quiet rhythm of working side by side. They rarely spoke, but when they did, it was about things that mattered. "Remember that old oak we saved from the storm?" Darian asked one morning, sanding a plank. "Yeah," Kale said, drilling a pilot hole. "You said it had one more life in it." "It did," Darian replied, glancing at the platform taking shape. "Now it's helping others live." Back in town, Maris and Thorne had settled into a new routine, one that surprised even them. Maris had officially retired from her volunteer role at the Nature Center, and now co-led a monthly coastal stewards group for adults. They met in the library basement, discussing everything from plastic pollution to how to build backyard rain gardens. She'd even started wearing mud-splattered boots on weekends. Thorne, for his part, had become something of an unlikely advocate. He'd used his old banking connections to help secure a small grant for the sanctuary's educational programs. He didn't talk about it much, but Alowan found out when Rhea mentioned it during a planning meeting. He came in with paperwork, Rhea said, eyes wide, sat through the whole budget review. Asked smart questions, Alowan smiled. "That's new. It's like he's trying to understand," Rhea added. "Not just fund it, but really get it." And he was. One Saturday, Thorne showed up at the sanctuary with a notebook and a thermos of coffee. He didn't announce himself. He just walked the trails, took notes, and asked Rhea about the oyster reef restoration project. When she explained how oysters filter water and create habitats, he listened, really listened, and later sent her a link to a study on shellfish economics with a note. Thought this might help. It wasn't a grand gesture, but coming from him, it meant everything. The real turning point came during the sanctuary's first community open house. It was a warm April day, the kind where the air smells like salt and blooming beach plum. Families arrived with picnic baskets, students with field journals, and retirees with binoculars slung around their necks. There were guided walks, touch tanks filled with starfish and sea urchins, and a small exhibit on the history of the coastline. Maris and Thorne arrived early, not as guests, but as volunteers. Maris helped set up the children's activity table, carefully arranging shells and magnifying glasses. Thorne stood by the parking area, directing cars with a seriousness usually reserved for board meetings. Alowan saw them and paused. She hadn't asked them to come. She hadn't expected it. But there they were, wearing volunteer badges, smiling at strangers, answering questions they'd clearly studied in advance. At one point, a little boy tugged on Thorne's sleeve. "Mister, why's the water brown here?" Thorne knelt, something Elowen had never seen him do, and pointed to the marsh grass. Because the roots hold the soil. It's not dirty, it's working. The boy's eyes lit up. Like a filter? Exactly like a filter. Later, Elowen found her mother folding brochures near the welcome center. You didn't have to do this, she said softly. Maris looked up, her hands still moving. I know, but I wanted to. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No need to explain or justify. Just a simple truth, she'd changed. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like sand shaping a shore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and guests began to leave, the four of them, Elowen, Cale, Maris, and Thorne, stood together on the observation deck. Darian was inside helping Rhea pack up supplies. For a long time, no one spoke. They just watched the egrets glide across the water, their wings catching the last light. Finally, Thorne cleared his throat. I never understood why you loved this place so much, he said to Elowen. I thought it was just scenery. She turned to him. It's not scenery, Dad, it's a living system. Every crab, every blade of grass, every drop of water, it's all connected. He nodded slowly. I think I'm starting to see that. Maris reached for Elowen's hand. We're proud of you, she said, her voice thick. Not just for what you've built, but for who you are. Elowen squeezed back. I couldn't have done it without all of you. And it was true. Not because they'd been perfect, but because they'd tried. Because they'd shown up even when it was uncomfortable. Because love, real love, isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being willing to grow after you do. Over the next few weeks, the sanctuary became a hub of quiet transformation. Local fishermen, once skeptical of another protected area, began partnering with Rhea to share traditional knowledge about fish populations. A group of teens started a plastic patrol, collecting trash along the shore and turning it into art installations. Even the town council approved a resolution to reduce single-use plastics in public events, something unthinkable just a year before. Darian watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He still spent his mornings in his workshop, carving small tokens for visitors, a whale from walnut, a seashell from cherrywood, but now he also led a weekly Stories by the Shore session, where he'd sit on a log and tell tales of the coast as it used to be, when the clams were thick, the water clear, and the stars so bright you could navigate by them. People came not for facts, but for feeling. And in those stories, they found a reason to care. One afternoon, as he packed up after a session, a woman approached him. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. My husband and I used to bring our kids here, she said, before the condos went up. Before it all changed, Darian nodded. It's coming back. Because of you, she said. He shook his head. Because of all of us, she smiled. Still, thank you for remembering what mattered. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just tipped his hat and walked back to his truck. That night, over dinner at the cottage, Cale asked, Do you ever regret not doing something bigger? Like opening a shop or writing a book? Darian stirred his soup. Bigger isn't always better. I built things that last, not with nails but with care. That's enough. Elowen looked at him across the table, the man who'd given them land, legacy, and a second chance at family, and felt a swell of gratitude so deep it hurt. Later, she found an old photo in a drawer, Kyle as a boy, standing beside his father in front of a half-built shed, both of them covered in sawdust, grinning like they'd just discovered a secret. She framed it and hung it in the welcome center, next to a quote she'd written herself, "The best foundations are built with love, not concrete." As May arrived, the sanctuary hosted its first overnight student group, 10 high schoolers from an underserved urban school, many of whom had never seen the ocean before. They arrived wide-eyed, clutching backpacks and sleeping bags, unsure what to expect. Elowen greeted them at the trailhead. Welcome to your classroom, she said. That night, under a sky thick with stars, the students sat around a campfire, in a designated fire-safe pit, of course, roasting marshmallows and asking questions that ranged from "Do sharks sleep?" to "Can one person really make a difference?" Darian joined them, not as a teacher, but as a fellow learner. He told them about watching the tides change over 50 years, about how the same heron might return to the same nest for decades, about how small things like not littering or planting native flowers add up. One girl, quiet until then, spoke up. My grandma says the earth is crying. Is that true? Darian thought for a long time. Maybe, but I think it's also healing. And it's waiting for us to help. The girl nodded, as if that made sense. The next morning as the bus pulled away, every student left behind a small stone they'd painted with a promise. I'll pick up trash. I'll save water. I'll tell my friends. Elowen kept those stones in a glass jar on her desk. On hard days, she'd hold one and remember, change starts small. Back in Briar Hollow, life continued to shift in gentle ways. Maris started a community garden behind the library, using compost from the sanctuary's education program. Thorn began mentoring a young entrepreneur who wanted to start a zero-waste cafe. They didn't talk about redemption. They just lived it, and Darian, he kept working. Not for praise, not for legacy, but because it felt right. One evening, as he and Cale finished installing a new bench near the marsh overlook, Cale said, "You know, people are calling you a hero." Darian laughed, a rare, full sound. "I'm just a man who loved his son enough to listen." Kyle looked at him, eyes serious. "That's the rarest kind of hero there is." The sun set behind them, painting the water in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the reeds a red-winged blackbird called. And in that moment, everything felt whole. Not because the past was forgotten, but because the future was being built, one honest act at a time. 2 years after the wedding, the meadow where Elowen and Cale had exchanged vows looked much the same. Wildflowers still bloomed in spring. The river still whispered over smooth stones, and the old oak at the edge of the field still offered shade on hot afternoons. But the people who gathered there on this warm September evening were different. Not in appearance, but in spirit. It was the sanctuary's 2nd anniversary, and instead of a formal celebration, they'd decided on something quieter, a community potluck under the stars, open to anyone who'd ever walked the trails, planted a seed, or simply stopped to watch the tide. There were no speeches scheduled, no program to follow, just food, music, and the kind of easy conversation that only comes when people feel they belong. Elowen moved through the crowd with a calm she hadn't known before. She wore a simple dress the color of sea glass and her hair loose, just as she had on her wedding day. But now her hands were rough from fieldwork, her skin kissed by sun and salt, and her smile came easier. She wasn't just a bride anymore. She was a steward, a teacher, a daughter who'd learned that love sometimes means holding space for others to change. Cale stood near the fire pit, helping a group of kids roast marshmallows without burning them. He'd grown into his role not as a leader, but as a builder, in every sense. The Welcome Center now had a second wing for overnight researchers, built entirely from salvaged materials. He'd even designed a tiny library nook filled with donated books about the ocean, birds, and local history. Children called it Kyle's Corner, and he never corrected them. Darian arrived just after sunset, as he always did, late enough to avoid fuss, early enough to help. He carried a wooden tray of sliced apples from his garden and a jar of wildflower honey. No one made a fuss when he arrived. They just nodded, smiled, or handed him a plate. That was the thing about Darian now. He didn't need to be seen to be valued. His presence was enough. Maris and Thorn came together carrying a large bowl of rosemary roasted vegetables, Maris's new specialty. They no longer stood apart, arms crossed, observing from a distance. Instead, they sat on a checkered blanket with a retired fisherman and a high school student who'd interned at the sanctuary that summer. Thorn was showing the boy how to identify cloud formations, something he'd recently learned from a nature app. Maurice laughed at something the fisherman said, genuine, unguarded laughter. It was a small thing, but to Elowen, watching from across the field, it felt like a miracle. Later, as dusk deepened into night and string lights flickered to life, Rhea gathered a few people for a walk along the newly restored dune path. "We've got nesting plovers this year," she said, voice hushed with excitement. First time in over a decade. The group followed her in silence, careful not to disturb the fragile ecosystem. Even the children walked softly, eyes wide with wonder. When they reached the overlook, the moon hung low over the water, casting a silver path across the waves. Someone whispered, "It's like the ocean's breathing." Back at the meadow, Darian sat alone on a bench he and Cale had built the previous winter. He wasn't lonely, just resting. His hands, still strong but now marked with the lines of time, rested on his knees. He watched the firelight dance on faces, listened to the murmur of voices, and felt a quiet fullness in his chest. He hadn't set out to change anyone, He'd only wanted to give his son and Eloan something real, a place where their love for the earth could take root and grow. But in doing so, he'd given others something too, a mirror, a chance to see beyond first impressions, beyond status or background, and recognize the quiet strength and humility. A little girl, no more than 6, approached him, holding a drawing. "Mr. Darien?" she asked shyly. He smiled. "That's me." She handed him the paper. It showed a man with silver hair standing beside a sea turtle, with the words, "Thank you for saving our beach," written in wobbly letters. He took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "This is the best gift I've ever received." She beamed and ran back to her parents. He tucked the drawing into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Inside the welcome center, Eloan flipped through the guest book, a thick, cloth-bound journal where visitors left notes. Some were simple. "Saw my first heron today." Others were deeper. "Came here after losing my job. Felt peace for the first time in months." One entry, written in careful cursive, read, "My husband and I scattered our daughter's ashes here last spring. She loved the ocean. Thank you for keeping it safe for her." Eloan closed the book gently. This place wasn't just about conservation. It was about connection, about healing, about remembering that we're all part of something larger. Cale found her there, leaning against the doorframe. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking how far we've come." "From what?" he asked, stepping closer. "From thinking love was enough on its own," she said. "It is, but it needs action to live." He wrapped an arm around her. "Dad knew that all along." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the distant laughter, the crackle of the fire, the soft hush of the wind through the pines. The next morning, before the guests had fully packed up, Darien walked the trails alone. He checked the bird boxes, adjusted a loose signpost, and paused at the memorial stone they'd placed near the marsh, a smooth piece of granite engraved with a single line, "For those who listen to the earth." He ran a hand over the letters, then continued on. At the edge of the sanctuary, where the land met the protected coastline, he stopped. This was the spot he'd first walked 2 years ago, when the developers' plans were still fresh in the news. Back then, it had felt like a race against time. Now, it felt like a promise kept. He knelt and pressed his palm into the damp soil, not in ownership, but in gratitude. Later that day, as the last cars pulled away and the meadow returned to stillness, the 4 of them, Eloan, Cale, Maris, and Thorne, helped Darien load his truck. There was no fanfare, no farewell speech, just the easy rhythm of people who'd learned to move together. Before he left, Maris stepped forward. She didn't hug him. Physical affection still didn't come naturally, but she placed a small package in his hands. "It's a journal," she said. "I thought you might want to write down your stories, the ones you tell by the shore." Darien accepted it. "Thank you." Thorne cleared his throat. "If you ever need help with anything, the sanctuary, the workshop, just say the word." Darien nodded. "I will." Then he turned to Eloan and Kyle. "You've built something good here." "We had help," Kyle said. "The best kind," Darien replied. He drove away slowly, his truck disappearing down the gravel road until it was just a speck in the distance. But his presence lingered, in the bench by the marsh, in the music box still displayed in the welcome center, in the way people now paused before judging, choosing curiosity over assumption. Over the next year, the sanctuary continued to grow, not in size but in meaning. It became a model for other communities, not because of grand funding or famous names, but because it was rooted in real people doing real work. Schools from 3 counties made it part of their curriculum. Local artists held plein air painting sessions on the bluffs. Even the town's annual fair added a sanctuary day, where kids could build birdhouses and learn about native plants. Eloan eventually returned to field research, but now she brought students with her, training the next generation not just in science but in stewardship. Cale took on fewer private clients and began teaching workshops on sustainable building, often with Darien by his side, demonstrating how to shape wood with respect, not force. Maris and Thorne, now in their 70s, became fixtures at sanctuary events. Maris started a Wisdom Walk series, where elders shared stories of how the land used to be. Thorne, to everyone's surprise, learned to kayak and now led gentle paddles through the estuary, pointing out fish nurseries and explaining tidal flows with the same precision he once used for balance sheets. And Darian? He never stopped working. But now, when he carved a piece of wood, he signed it. Not for fame, but so people would know that hands matter. That time matters. That love, when given without expectation, can ripple farther than anyone imagines. One evening, years later, a young couple stood at the sanctuary's overlook, watching the sunset. The woman pointed to a plaque near the trailhead. In honor of Darian Vale, whose quiet gift taught us that the greatest legacies are not built with stone, but with heart. Who was he? The man asked. The woman smiled. A carpenter, a father, and the reason this place still breathes. They stood in silence as the sky turned gold, then violet, then deep blue. Somewhere in the marsh a frog croaked. The tide rolled in, and the earth, as it always does, kept turning, gentler, wiser, and full of second chances. In Briar Hollow, people still talk about the wedding where a simple gift changed everything. Not because it was expensive, but because it was true, and in a world that often measures worth in noise and speed. That truth remains the rarest kind of magic, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up, not to prove you're right, but to prove you care, and in the end, that's what lasts.